This comes from a very international project. So I first started collecting historical data of income and wealth in France 15 years ago. Then Tony Atkinson, who is a very distinguished British economist and who is in a way the godfather of many of the historical studies of income and wealth inequality, who wrote in 1978 a very important book on inheritance data for Britain and looking at historical wealth inequality in Britain, and he's been a major contributor to this historical database that we have been collecting, and more generally, there's a long tradition of British with the study of inequality, the study of inheritance, the study of wealth, from Juncture to James Lewis. And there's also a long British tradition of thinking about progressive taxation of income and wealth, which was invented in Britain and partly in the United States much more than the continent. And it's important to be aware of that. And I think one of the reasons for putting these issues of inequality into this broad historical perspective is to not lose this memory, which I think is important not only for the sake of history, but also to look at the future. So anyway, many people have contributed to this data collection process. With Emmanuel Saez, we've been studying the case of the US, with Facundo Alvarado, we looked at Argentina, with Energy India. Constantine Rosenthal Zuckman have worked with me on collecting historical data on wealth and inheritance rather than income. So, the book also includes part 4 about the future and those policy conclusions for the future, but let me make very clear that you can very well disagree with everything that's in part 4 and still find some interest in part 1, 2, and 3. So, I am not better at analyzing the past and the future, like everyone of us, and I don't pretend, I try to draw the most reasonable conclusion for the future from the basis of historical evidence, but I don't pretend these are very difficult conclusions. I think we are in the social sciences, we are not at the terms of study of the history of the into an exact science, and ultimately the objective of this research is to contribute to a more informed public debate and everybody to sort of write their own part 4 and their own conclusion. So, and give you some of my conclusions. I think part 1, 2, and 3 are actually 90% of the book and are probably more important than the last 10%. Okay, so there is really 2 sets of data that I put together on this book. Data on income and data on wealth. And to a large extent, this book is going to shift the attention from income to wealth. So of course, both are important, and wealth is partly the result of accumulation of saving out of income, so both are very related. But wealth is a more complicated object than income, because it also involves inherited wealth, it involves natural resources that have not been saved by anyone. So it's and also the concentration of wealth is always higher than income, so it induces even a stronger political type and dispute. And this book is trying to argue that we have to look not only at the rise of income inequality, but also the dynamics of wealth inequality and concentration. So the first part of the data on income comes from this World of Income database. So I'm sorry that the colors are not really clear, but there are some countries in red, which are the countries that are already in the database, and the countries in blue are about to enter the database. So being in this World of Income database means that we use all the historical data on income, particularly coming from the income tax, that can be used in order to compute series on income inequality. So the modern progressive income tax was introduced in Britain in 1909, in the US in 1913, in France in 1914, in India in 1922, in Japan and Germany it was a bit earlier in the late 19th century. So we start between 1900 and 1920, so then 1890 in Russia or Japan, but basically around 1900, 1920 you have data on income, which it takes a long time to collect the data, to try to make meaningful series out of the raw material, so I'm not going to spend time about the details. This is the typical outcome we get out of this data. So this is what we get from the United States. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10% of the distribution. So it's a very simple indicator of inequality. So as you can see, during the first part of the 20th century, we have an important decline in income inequality. And then, in the past 3 decades, you have a quite spectacular rise in the share going to the top 10%. So the share of total income going to the top 10% was sort of stable between, a little bit below 35%, between 30 and 35%, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then it has increased up to almost 50%. In fact, I have not put on this graph the most recent data point, which is for 2012, where it's a little bit above 50%. The latest data point there is online in the United States a couple of months ago, which was not ready at the time of the book. So the trend seems to be continuing. Okay? Now, the first part of the decline in income inequality is what Kuznets found in the 1950s. Okay? So Kuznets was a Ukrainian-born American economist who computed the first GDP series for the US. And then his next task in the 50s was to use this very same income tax data that we've been using for the US from 1913 to 1948. And what he found is a very large decline in the share of national income going to the top 10%. Now, all what we've been doing in this work and with this database is to extend the work of Kuznets to many more countries. Okay, so instead, and longer time period. So instead of having one country over a 35-year period, which is all what Kuznets had, we have over 20 countries around that. But our methods and data are basically the same as Kuznets. So it's just that with the modern information technology, we can produce and use much larger volumes of data. Also, maybe one reason why it was not done before, which I think is a bit sad, is the sort of very sharp boundaries between the social sciences and collecting this historical data for many people, too historical for economists and too economic for historians, and so nobody was doing it. But it's just a lot of time, a lot of work, but it's just extending what Kuznets did. Now, as you can see, this changes quite a lot the perception also of the substance of the matter, because in the 50s, 60s, Kuznets came with very optimistic conclusion, saying that you have basically a decline in inequality in advanced stages of development. And indeed, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was quite a lot of optimism with the view, this very strong view of balanced growth. When you have a stable share going to the top 10%, it means that all income groups benefit from aggregate growth. We have the same growth rate for top 10% income, for bottom 90% income, so we have a very balanced distribution of income gains. Whereas in the recent period, this very large increase means that over a 30-year period between 1990 and 2010, you have between 2/3 and 3/4 of aggregate US income growth that went to the top 10% and most of it to the top 1%. Okay? So given that the growth performance of the US economy was not that great in this period, per capita GDP growth of 1.5%, if you get 2/3 of that or 3/4 of that to the top 1%, it's not clear that this is a good deal for the rest of the population. So this has attracted a lot of attention because the trends are big. So how far is that going to go? I think nobody knows. Is that going to stabilize right at 50%? Is it going to go 60% of total income for the top 10 in 2020, 70%? Some people seem to believe that wherever it goes will be fine because this is where the market takes us, and the market rewards talent efficiently and that. But I think at some point you have to look at the numbers. The numbers are so big, the share of total income goes from 30% to 50% or 60%. It's not just a problem of symbolic, it's really a problem of macroeconomic solutions. So, big part of the book is trying to understand these trends of income, and in particular, we try to compare with other countries. So for the UK, it will be less spectacular. It will be sort of in between stability and the US, and in continental Europe and Japan, it will be a slight rise, but almost stable. It will be much less spectacular than the US, and also less spectacular rise in terms of shares in the UK. So in the book, I use studies that we have done with the NSA and Stephanie Stancheva trying to account for this, and what we argue is that the big rise of top managerial compensation in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK is hard to account for simply with skill-based rising productivity of managers kind of model. Because otherwise, it's difficult to explain when it's so concentrated in certain countries and so concentrated, like the US being the top one or the top 0.1%. It's not that these people have so much more education than the people who write below that. So it's really hard with a pure skill-based and supply and demand for skill model to explain for what we are. And there seems to be a lot of what's happening has to do with the fact that the marginal product of top managers is quite difficult to observe. And when you have a huge reduction in the top income tax rate, and in terms of this in the US and large extent in the UK as well, this probably has contributed to change to a large extent the nature of the game at the top end of the distribution of compensation and executive compensation. You have a much stronger incentive when the top tax rate is 30 or 40%, 20% as it was in the US, in the UK until the 70s. You have a much stronger incentive to try to put the right people in the compensation committee so as to get 1 million more. Now, whether this is good for the performance of the company is not really visible in the data we have. We compare companies and we compare the performance. What you observe is the elasticity of the top managerial compensation with respect to meaningful profits. So profits that are variations that are changing in exchange rate, changing in raw material prices or sector averages, and the elasticity of managerial compensation with respect to meaningful profits is in fact even higher than the elasticity of compensation with respect to the profits that are filtered for the sector level variations that constitute the actual managerial action. So that doesn't look as if the incentive model is really working. It's more like when there's cash at the table, you tend to take it if you can. So anyway, that's an important part of the book, but that's not the most important part. So the most important part of the book, as I explained, is to shift the attention from the rise of top income shares to the rise of wealth and wealth accumulation. So I'm going to show you another graph which looks a little bit like this, but which in fact comes from a completely different story and has nothing to do with top managerial compensation. And this graph is this one, and this measures the evolution of the capital income ratio in a number of European countries, Germany, France, UK. And you can see that, so this is the value, this is aggregate net private wealth. So this is the value of what the private households own in these countries expressed as a fraction of national income. So what they own is real estate assets, financial assets, minus liabilities. So this is net wealth, net capital. And as you can see, you have the same kind of U-shaped curve that you have here, the huge decline following the war, the Great Depression, and then a steady increase starting in the 50s, 60s, and even more so since the 70s. Now, this process has actually very little to do with this one. This process, this graph is not really about, it's actually not at all per se about inequality. We could have a completely egalitarian society where everyone has the same share in aggregate wealth, and still you could have a rise of the wealth to income ratio. So the rise of the wealth to income ratio is not bad per se. In fact, in many ways, this is good news for European countries that they have a lot of assets. So let me show you, another graph for the higher number of countries. So here you have net private capital for the top 8 developed countries in the world in terms of GDP, US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Canada, Australia. And you have net public capital. So net public capital is defined in the same way as net private capital. So these are public assets minus public debt. So this can be negative, like for Italy, they have negative net public capital, it means that they have more debt than assets. So even if they were to sell all the public buildings, we still have some debt left. Now, you can see that together during the recent period, the past few decades, you have at the same time a rise in private capital and a decline in public capital. So including in Britain, of course, because you have privatization, so you have a decline in public assets, and you have a rise in public debt. So if you have less assets and more debt, of course, the net public capital declines. And this is the same pretty much in every country. But you can also see that the increase in private capital has been a lot larger than the decline in public capital. So in other words, instead of, sometimes in Europe we behave as if we only have debt, we only have public debt, private debt, and as if Europe was owned by some established entities, the Emir of Qatar, or California pension fund, or the Bank of China, or whatever. Europe is rich. European countries have never been as rich in terms of net private wealth, and if you sum private capital and public capital, you have national capital or net national wealth, and actually this has never been as high for an entire century. You have to return to the pre-World War I period to have such a large quantity of net national capital with respect to years of GDP and national income. Okay? So this is, per se, this is good news. This means that European countries are rich, these are governments which are poor, which is a problem, of course, and we need to find ways to get organized. But at least, our economic fundamentals are much better than what we believe. Now, the problem, of course, is the inequality of capital property. So, these are the 3 points. I think I'm going to limit myself to the first 2 points because I've been talking about America for weeks now, so now I can talk about America, which is the end, and care more about the European debate and US debate, so this is very good for me. So these are the 2 points that I will make. First point I just made it, which is this return of what I call patrimonial or wealth-based society in Europe and actually also in Japan. We don't have the time to see on my previous graph probably, but you have a huge rise in the wealth-income ratio in Japan and in Europe. And in effect, your wealth-income ratio seems to be returning to very high levels in these low growth countries. Because you have, in particular, you have very low population growth in recent decades in Japan and in most European countries. And that's a big difference with the US, where you have higher population growth. And this makes a big difference for the following reason. The basic intuition is that when you have a slow growth society, wealth accumulated in the past can naturally become very important. And the basic idea is that take the extreme case with zero population growth or zero population growth. If you keep saving and investing each year 10% of your national income, your capital income ratio will go to the sky. So at some point you must know what to do with the money, and probably you will have huge real estate bubbles, and you will have and this is a little bit what we have actually. But so the only difference is that instead of having zero growth, we have slightly positive growth. So population growth and productivity growth in the past 10 years, in the past 20 to 30 years have been 1.5% on average in European countries. Now, if you there's a very simple formula that I try to explain in the book, which is that if you save 10% per year and your total GDP growth is say 1.5%, in the long run you will tend to accumulate quantity of capital equal to 10 divided by 1.5 years of national income. That's forgetting about bubbles. So if you have real estate bubble which increase in asset prices is a little bit higher, then you can go down with the bubble explode. But the sort of long run equilibrium toward which you tend to converge can be quite large. So the basic explanation for this big rise of capital income ratio and this return to sort of very high wealth income ratios that we had in the past it simply comes from the fact that slow growth, wealth accumulated in the past naturally became very important. And in the long run, this can be relevant for the entire world, and give and present some simple projections for the future. This is just using United Nations demographic projections for China and Asia, and taking as given the assumptions that we're going to have continued convergence in per capita GDP, taking current trends saving rates. So of course, that's making a lot of assumptions. So, there's only one possible scenario, but at least with the kind of population growth decline that we have in the standard projections, even if we keep the same productivity growth as what we had in recent decades, there is a natural tendency of capital income ratio to rise at the global level. Now, this is not, again, this is not necessarily bad per se, but this implies that the issue of wealth and concentration of wealth and access to wealth, and how do you make sure that you have a middle class that gets a decent share of national wealth, and how do you make sure that the middle class share is not shrinking? This issue becomes very important when wealth becomes very important. So, this is the return of patrimonial societies can be very good, maybe good to have a lot of capital, but the issue of inequality of wealth becomes even more important. So my second point, and I will try to shift faster, is that one important determinant of wealth inequality in the long run is the gap between R and G, where R is the rate of return to capital and G is the growth rate. And my basic point is that the higher R minus G, you tend to converge to higher inequality of wealth. So this will stop somewhere, but this will stop at a level of inequality of wealth that can be quite large. And I think this is largely what explains the very large level of wealth concentration that we've seen in the past pretty much everywhere in Europe until World War I. And I think there are reasons to believe that in the future we might return to high R minus G. Let me make clear right away, because when I make this statement, sometimes people are really surprised at the logical viewpoint and people think, how can it be that R can be bigger than G forever? So let me make clear right away that this is exactly what we get in the most standard economic model, and even more importantly, this is what you get during most of human history. So during most of human history, the growth rate was equal to 0%. During the pre-industrial revolution societies, in agrarian societies, there was zero population growth, and there was very small productivity growth. So let me show you some estimates for this. Okay, so these are estimates for growth rate over 2,000 of years. So of course, this was this is imperfect data, but at the other hand, the simple reason why we can be sure that the growth rates were pretty small until the Industrial Revolution is simply that even a growth rate of 0.2% or 0.3% per year during 1,000 years would imply that the population at the world level was less than 200 inhabitants at the time of Christ. And we know there is a lot of evidence showing the higher population at that time. And people disagree as to whether it was 50 million, 60 million, and I don't have a strong opinion about this. But in any case, we know just from a purely logical viewpoint that growth, both for population and productivity, was very close to 0% during most of human history. Now, R bigger than G was very obvious at that time. And in fact, everybody in agrarian societies knows that R was bigger than G. So people would not say it this way, but certainly if you read any novel like Jane Austen or Balzac, you will notice that everybody knows that the rate of return is somewhere between 4 and 5%. So they don't even have to say it because it is so obvious to the reader that if you want an annual income of 1,000 pounds, you need a capital of 20,000 pounds, because 5% of 20 will give you 1,000 pounds per year. Everybody knows it, so that they don't even have to say it. It's just it has such important consequences for the life of people, certain values, certain flags, certain standards, that it is vitally important. It is not only income and money matters are important matters, and so with a rate of return of 4 to 5%, of course the gap was very large. Now during the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate increased somewhat, but until World War I, the growth rates were not larger than 1.5%. Now in the 20th century, the growth rate at the world level reach very high level, over 3% in the post-war period. But it's important to realize that more than half of these 4% growth rate are due to population growth. And even today, at the world level, when we say the world GDP is going to rise at 3 or 3.5% in 2014, half of it is population. Per capita GDP is only rising at 1.5 at the world level, even accounting for China, even accounting for America. So here, all what I've done in this graph is to take the UN population projection, the central scenario, according to which population growth is going to decline pretty much everywhere, and this per se pushes growth rate to low level and increases the gap between R and G. So I think the only reason why this equilibrium between R and G was changed in the 20th century is really due to pretty unusual events. Large population growth is one. The other important event, of course, is that you had huge shocks to private rates of return due to World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. So here I do not take into account the capital destruction, taxation, and various shocks to capital. If I put them back in, this is what you get. So this is the after tax and after capital loss rate of return between 1930 and 1950 was actually below the growth rate and very small. On many assets it was actually negative, and on average, I'm not pretending that the numbers are perfectly accurate. These are estimates, but I think the orders of magnitude are right. And most importantly, what has really changed during the 20th century is that due to relatively unusual events, the very sharp shocks to the rate of return, and also the very large growth performance of the post-war period, which was due partly to population growth and also partly to the recovery and the reconstruction going on in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, induced a complete reversal between the ordering for the growth rate and the rate of return. If even more concrete example of R bigger than G in the recent period would be this. Okay, so here on this table, I am using a data source that is not particularly reliable, let me say right away, which are the Forbes ranking of global billionaire. So I start in 1987 because this is when the Forbes magazine started publishing their ranking. So it's not perfectly reliable, and it's a bit sad in a way that people have to get magazines to learn how it works. And I would prefer if they were to buy Eurostat publications or IMF publications, but we don't find the information. So actually one reason why I like the progressive wealth tax idea is that because it's a way to bring more financial transparency and more public knowledge about wealth dynamics, and taxation is always a way to produce legal categories and democratic transparency of income, profits, wealth, anyway, this is the data we have, and what you see is that, okay, as we all know, from these rankings that are published not only by Forbes, but by various magazines in every country, in Britain, in Germany, in France, there's been a large rise in the number of billionaires. Now, this per se is not surprising with the large growth at the world level when we want to have more billionaires. What's more interesting is to look, to take a constant fraction of the world population, how fast the average wealth of this group has been rising. Okay? And the answer is that they've been rising 3 times faster than the size of the world economy. The sense that you have, so these are not the same people all over the period. These top groups, some people move out, some new people come in, typically new billionaires from emerging countries. But if we were in an equilibrium, if we were in a steady state in the world inequality of wealth, the average wealth of this top group should rise at the same speed as average wealth at the world level. Now, this is not at all what you have, because as you can see, so world GDP growth over this period has been 3.3%, which is quite good, but in fact more than half of it corresponds to population growth, 1.9%. So the per capita GDP and per capita income has only increased by 1.4% per year over the period. This was what I was saying earlier. So, a big part of the feeling of growth that we have in the world today is still coming from the rise of population. Now, the growth rate for average wealth has been larger than 1.4%, 2.1%, which corresponds to the rise in the wealth to income ratio I was describing before. But still, 2.1% is 3 times less than 6 to 7%. So, if the top of the distribution is rising 3 times faster than the average, it means that we are in a period of rising concentration of wealth. How far will this go? Where will this stop? I don't know. It's not that I have an answer to exactly what will be the threshold and what will be. I'm just saying that this can get very far faster than we think. So these simple mechanics of rate of return and growth rate. So of course it could be that we manage. I hear some reviews saying growth rate, we just have to increase growth rate, etc. Okay, if we can increase growth rate 4 or 5% per year, that would be great. And, in case this happens, that we won't need other solution to sort of balance this process of wealth concentration and what is poverty, and that will be fine. But I think we should not bet on that. At least we should have another plan in case it doesn't happen. So, in case the growth rate don't go up to 4 or 5%, in case even if we do everything we can to promote innovation, invest in skills, invest in education, and of course we should do that. But even with the most we do, probably the growth rate will not be that much larger than 1.5–2%. In the long run, that's always quite fast productivity growth. That's enough to renew at each generation in the space of 30 years. 1/3 or 1/2 of the economy is being renewed with 1.5 productivity growth per year. That's pretty fast growth. It requires a good education system so that everybody can access the right skills, the right jobs. It's not small growth, but that's not going to be sufficient probably to equilibrate this process of rising concentration of wealth. So then just a few words about the solution. I think there are many different possible solutions. You have different countries that invent their own way. Inflation can be a way to redistribute wealth. Can be a way to reduce the public debt, which has been very important historically. The problem with inflation is that you don't only destroy the public debt, you also destroy the wealth of people who only have saving accounts. So typically, this is like a tax on low wealth holders, whereas higher wealth portfolio, the stock and real estate, the price of equity or the price of real estate will probably rise with inflation, so they will not be hurt at all by inflation. So it's like inflation is like a regressive wealth tax, if you wish. So I tend to prefer the progressive wealth tax, which in a way is the civilized form of inflation. So it does the same thing, but you can protect people. So I make some proposal of what the tax rate would look like. You could have very low or zero tax rate below 1 million euros in net wealth, and then 1% below 1 million, and then 2% below 5 million. That would give us a very large level of wealth to income ratio that would be enough to have 2% of GDP in tax revenue. So I think I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow morning, but I think it's worth thinking about when you have such a vibrant wealth tax base and stagnant income and stagnant wages, it would be crazy not to think about this tax base. And I think it's an issue that's beyond left and right. In Spain, Harold is not particularly left wing. We introduced the wealth tax that was suppressed by Zapatero. In Italy, Monti introduced the wealth tax, except that it was done in the wrong way because the tax rate on real estate was 8 times bigger than the tax rate on financial assets. So everybody in Europe was saying that Monti was a genius of public finance, but the Italians did not agree because the Italians said, okay, you can pay. When I have a small house of 100,000 euros, I pay a tax rate 8 times bigger than someone who has billions of euros in financial assets. That doesn't sound right. And I think the problem is that if you don't have more fiscal cooperation, it's difficult to have as much progressivity as you would like. Still, individual countries can make progress. You can have a more progressive system of taxation of net wealth, including in the UK or in France or in the US. If you have a higher tax rate than mentioned, that doesn't mean that mentioned will cross the channel immediately in France. So some progress can be made with progressive taxation of wealth just at the national level. And then, I think more generally the history of taxation is full of surprise, and let me conclude maybe by this. If you look at the history of top income tax rates over the past century, and so here we have 4 countries, the US, Germany, and France. Many people 100 years ago, in 1900, 1910, would predict that the progressive income tax would never happen, and then things happen. And sometimes governments don't plan in advance what they're going to do. In France, it was a right-wing government in the early 20s that suddenly introduced progressive taxation of income, whereas in 1914 they didn't want an income tax, the tax rate of 2%. So sometimes things change, and not only because of war, but also because of financial crisis, and because also the democratic institutions can respond to concerns, the growing concerns about inequality. So, and even at the international level, let me conclude with this. 5 years ago, nobody would have said that it was possible to do something with the Swiss banks and banks in Switzerland, and then there were sanctions by the US government, and there was a change to the transmission of information from Swiss banks to other countries. I'm quite sad that European countries were not able to tackle the problem before, because in a way, European countries have lots more to lose than the US from Switzerland and European tax havens. But this shows that things can change sometime, and this is a pretty chaotic history. As you can see, the US and the UK are really the countries that have invented progressive taxation at very high levels of income and also of inheritance. If you look at these are the top tax rate for inheritance, you can also see that France and Germany have always been historically much more cautious and much more reasonable, if you want, with top tax rates than the US and the UK. The only time you can see that the only time in history where Germany has a 90% top tax rate was between 1946 and 1948, and this is when their tax policy is set by the Americans. This is not a good. The Allied control council that set the tax policy of Germany, and when the Bundesrepublik gets it back to sovereignty in the 1950s, they reduced the tax rate immediately to what they view to much more reasonable levels compared to this crazy American and Anglo-Saxon levels. And this was the same in Japan. In Japan, the only year where we had 90% of tax rate is 1948. And now the US were not doing that to punish the Germans or the Japanese, because they were doing the same at home. So this was not a punishment. This is part of the civilization package of the time, and the sense that the Americans wanted to bring democratic institutions, and also the fiscal institutions that prevent democracies from becoming plutocracies and from developing excessive concentration of wealth, which in the end turned against the democratic process. And this was also a strong concern in this country. Very nice book in Power Period, Russia, talking about inheritance in the UK, and in the last edition before the war in 1938, conclude that political democracies to be sustainable also need to democratize wealth and to democratize property. And I think it's important when we study this issue to realize that they are not started 10 years ago, they are part of a long history. And I don't know what's going to happen next, but again, I think we should not take as granted that nothing will ever change. And this is the story of income and wealth is not just an economic history. It is a political, cultural, social histories, and it will always be so. Thank you.
2 minutes now for questions and discussion. I would like, if possible, to start with questions on the analysis, on the basic core arguments that have been advanced, and then perhaps in the second half of our session, move to some of the politics and the policy solutions that we've just been hearing about. If you could say where you are, sorry, who you are, where you're from, would be very helpful, and please do keep your questions crisp, because I know lots of people want to come in, so no long theses, please. So there's a roving mic, so we're going to start over here.
My name is David G. I used to be with the European Environment Agency for many years, just retired. What I like about the analysis is the shift in focus from the flow of income towards the stock of assets. And we find that in ecosystems and in energy, where we've gone with the flow of the services from ecosystems and ignored the assets, whereas with energy, we've gone with the stock of fossil fuels and ignored the flow. So getting that balance right is important. Following from that, as you posit ideas of taxing the stock of wealth, rather more than we have in the past, would it also be a good idea, therefore, to tax more than we do the stock of nature, reducing the tax on the flow of incomes as a sensible thing to do?
Okay, well, as that's a sort of policy question, can we just park that for a minute and just try and stick on the analysis for now? So, lady there, yeah. I hope these mics, can you hear the questions? Yeah. Can any of you guys turn the mics up, please?
I'm Frances Stewart from Oxford University, Development Economist. And I wonder if you could say more about R. You leave R sort of floating in the air. And why doesn't it change as the capital income ratio changes?
Okay, let's take one more and then we'll
Ben Phillips from Oxfam. My question is about the causation. Do you believe that this happened in some way by accident or unintentionally? Or do you believe this results from deliberate choices of leaders?
Okay. Let me take them in the reverse order. Choice of leaders, I don't know, but choice of the public opinion and the people, yes, indirectly, yes. No, I think in the, for instance, in the US, it's very striking. In Europe, I think the war had a big impact, and the Bolshevik Revolution also had a big impact. In the US, I think the democratic system sort of responded to the feeling in the 1910s, 1920s that inequality was becoming excessive. This was a big concern in the US at that time. This can seem very strange, but at that time, the US did not want to look like Europe. They felt Europe was very inegalitarian and I guess it's easy to say very but back in 1910, Europe was viewed as a very equal place, and indeed the concentration of wealth was a lot larger in Britain and France. And in France, people thought that inequality of wealth was not as extreme as in Britain, but in fact, the concentration of wealth in pretty much every European country was extreme in 1910. And there was this big speech in the US by Irving Fisher, who was not particularly extreme left-wing, and who was the president of the American Economic Association. In 1919, he gave this big speech to as president of the association, and saying, my fellow American economists, we have a big problem with the American economy, which is that we are becoming too unequal. The distribution of wealth is becoming undemocratic. We have to do something. And one solution would be a tax inheritance, 1/3 of the first generation, 2/3 of the second generation, and 3/3 of the third generation. And it's not exactly what happened, but if you look at the top tax rate for inheritance in the 1920s in the US, it is sort of what happened. And I'm not saying that's due to Irving Fisher, it was due to a combination of forces. But I think there was certainly some public dissatisfaction with rising inequality at that time. So no, I think these things don't happen at random. I think it's political forces, and of course it's not. I'm not saying there's not a mathematical formula saying that if wealth inequality passes this threshold, then there will be a reaction. It depends on the persuasion apparatus deployed by different groups, and it's a cognitive battle, if you want. We are a group, of course, different positions, unequal wealth can also feed into unequal political voice and influence, and so it's a complicated process. But I certainly I don't have the kind of pessimistic view that some people seem to have after some reviews of the book, and I'm very sad if some people became depressed or pessimistic. So in the book, because that's not at all the way I I think democratic forces and democratic systems can respond to this kind of challenges. It's not easy. The more technical questions about the rate of return and how this changes as the capital income ratio rises. So let me start with, so in the data, what we observe is that we've had a rise in the capital income ratio. So what I call beta, the divided by what has increased. The capital to income ratio has increased. And at the same time, the capital share in GDP has increased. The alpha, the share of capital income in total income has increased. Now, the standard economic model to explain this would be that you have a bit more substitution between capital and labor than the standard copy-glass production function. So in the standard economic model, the rate of return is determined by the marginal product of capital. And of course, when you have more capital, the rate of return will have to fall. The interesting question is how much will it fall? Will it fall exactly in the same proportion as the increase in the capital income ratio? That would be what economists call the copy-glass production function. But it's quite a miracle. So economists like miracles, but it doesn't have to be this way. The elasticity of substitution is going to be slightly bigger than what it's not. So the easiest way to interpret the data is that the set become higher than 1. In less technical terms, what this means is that there are many alternative uses for capital, so there's a lot you can do with capital. You can easily substitute labor for capital. But the extreme case would be what you all noticed that Amazon indicated in December that they are seriously thinking of replacing delivery workers by drones, which is an extreme case of capital labor substitution. I mean, in this case, they already seem to be treating their workers like drones, so I'm not so in the economic language, an economy where you can completely replace workers by robots and capital equipment will be an infinite elasticity of substitution. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, but you just need to assume that the elasticity of substitution is 1.2 or 1.3 instead of 1. It doesn't have to be infinite. To account for the fact that when you accumulate more capital, the rate of return, of course, is going to fall, but it's not going to fall as much as the increase of the capital income ratio. So that the capital share, which is a product of the two, will increase. So in other words, you could believe that the capital share rises to strong. Now, is this the only way to think about the problem, and is this the reason why capital shares have increased? No, I don't think so. I think this one sector model that economists have used in the production function is a very simplistic way to look at the problem. In practice, you really need to think of capital accumulation and capital share in a multi-sector model, where a big part of what has been happening, particularly in the UK and France, has to do with the real estate sector. So the increase in the value of real estate, the increase in the level of rent relative to national income cannot be explained entirely by the accumulation of saving and investment. The relative price of housing has increased a whole lot. And you have other sectors like the energy sector, the oil sector, which are also very capital intensive, where you have lots of movements in the relative price of the different goods and assets that matter a lot. So, at the end of the day, it's the simplest theory for the rate of return would be the one I described, but I think in practice it's a lot more complex. The different sectors and different types of assets give rise to different bargaining power and different social compromise between capital owners and workers, and different institutions. If you think of the real estate sector, rent control has played a huge role historically from rising, and even today, that's probably part of the explanation as to why in Germany real estate prices are such as in the rest of Europe or But there are many issues around this which I don't think we perfectly understand what the forces are. So I read the book and describes the different process. I'm not saying I have the answer for the exact role each one of the states, because they are all important. Increasing alternative uses for capital, rising real estate prices, but it's very much a matter for discussion in future research.
I want to go up to the balcony to make sure I get some people on there. So if you see a mic up there, there's a gentleman there, and I'll come down here. Start with you, and then bring another mic on to you. Yeah, please do.
It was about, if you could say something more about what solutions you saw to this problem. One of the things you were saying was that you said from DFID would be one solution, but I was maybe also interested in other solutions such as changes to regulation or even just changes to culture.
Thank you. Enzo Rossi, University of Amsterdam, a political theorist. Quick question about the notion of capital you employ in the book. So as I understand it, capital there is sort of physical stock plus money, but a lot of people think there's also such a thing as cultural capital, which can have tangible effects. So a family rich in cultural capital can send its kids to selective universities without spending money, and so then that helps their accumulation of tangible capital, so physical stock. Now, I was wondering, do you not consider this sort of thing in the book because it's impossible to get the same kind of data about it, or for some other sort of theoretical reason?
Okay, so then another French theorist, Bourdieu, and let's have one from down here then, and yeah, lady there. Sorry.
Can I just speak?
Okay, yes, sorry, yes. Sorry.
I don't really represent anyone now. But on your graph of the geographical distribution of capital and showing Asia with 50%, there was a big growth in Africa's share in recent years. Is that minerals and oil? And how do you value that? Is that in the ground? Or, I mean, it's the same question about what constitutes wealth and how you measure it. But it was quite remarkable that increase in Africa's capital, and I'd like to know what it's composed of.
We take those then, sort of question of what you mean by capital, a bit more on that. I'll do sort of approach on that question too. Maybe what you describe is really about the pricing of assets or sheet capital is my best.
Yeah, so let me start maybe with the cultural capital, the question of cultural capital. I do talk about the Bourdieu and the cultural capital and inequality, unequal access to culture and education in the region. This is playing a role, and for instance, at some point in the book, I compare changing average income of parents of Harvard University students. So right now, the average income of Harvard undergrad, the average income of the parents of Harvard undergrads corresponds to roughly the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution. So that doesn't mean that they only come from the top 2%, but they mean that the students that come from below the top 2% are sufficiently, they are not very numerous, they are sufficiently few, and the people within the top 2% are sufficiently high up in the top 2%, that the average for the entire cohort is equivalent to what you will get if you were just picking at random your students within the top 2%. So this is quite frightening in a way, because it's not. So if you do the same thing in, so I don't have the numbers for King's College. I can tell you that at Sciences Po in Paris, the equivalent number would be not the top 2%, but the top 9%, which is still quite elitist. It's a bit more open, but it's maybe less based on the parental income and sometimes more based on the cultural capital of the parents also. So I'm saying it's a deep challenge to every country. Unequal access to higher education, and trying to combine efficiency in the organization of the university system. And I can tell you that France has no lesson to give to anyone about how to organize the university system. I don't want to look as if I'm just saying bad things about I think trying to combine efficiency and equal access to higher education is a challenge that I think no country has a perfect solution, and countries have been experimenting solution. Yes, that's very important. So this kind of inequality in access to tertiary education does play a role in the book. I guess what the book is saying also is that education, culture is very important, but monetary capital, financial capital, real estate capital is also important. It would be a mistake to believe that one has replaced the other. But I don't want to go to the other extreme, which would be to say that cultural capital does not matter. I try to do justice to the two. I also try more generally the concept of capital and that I use in the book, to have a multidimensional approach to capital. So, sometimes I use the market value of these different assets, the market value of real estate, the market value of stock market companies, which also, by the way, includes immaterial capital. The big part of the stock market capitalization that I use, it does not correspond to physical capital. It corresponds to patents, it corresponds to reputation, there's a lot of organizational capital that's taken into account through the stock market capitalization. Anyway, when I use this market prices for assets to compute the aggregate value of capital, I try to make clear that this is a pretty abstract operation, and that this is not the only way, and this is not sufficient to understand everything that's going on. The story of real estate is not the story of oil, it's not the story of financial capital. So I try in the book to do justice to this multidimensionality of capital. Now, coming back more specifically to Asia and Africa, a lot of what you see in the graph I've shown you, comes from the evolution of the relative population of the different continents. In a way, it's not enough. You also need high per capita GDP to get high capital accumulation. But the rise of Africa and even more so the rise of Africa later on in the 21st century comes partly from the fact that Africa is supposed to be the only continent with a rising population in the future. Now, will it be so? And there's a lot of uncertainty. And for Asia, the 50% or 60% share in world capital at the end of the 21st century simply comes from the fact that the population projection puts them at 2/3 of the world population. So if you have continued convergence in per capita GDP, at some point you have to have almost 2/3 of GDP and capital. Now, many other things can happen in between. You can have political shocks, you can have maybe people in Europe will start having a lot of children again, we don't know. But now, regarding the price that's put on natural assets and natural capital, let me make clear, and there was a question also of the natural capital before, that the data we have is extremely imperfect, because these natural resources enter into the balance sheet only after they are discovered. So the oil assets and after they start being exploited economically. But as long as they are not exploited, as long as sometimes they have not been discovered, they do not enter into the balance sheet. So that's a very partial view of the problem we have to deal with capital. So in the final chapter of the book, I try to address this limitation, and I try to argue that of course the broader view of the future of natural capital should take into account possible damage to our natural capital stock, global warming and so on, which is of course a much more serious problem than our public debt, which, as I will show you, is just public debt to ourselves, and our national wealth is actually quite large, and we are much more concerned with the damage to this natural capital than monetary capital, which should quite large.
Okay, let's take on that. So, Andrew and let's take 4 to control this movement.
Andrew Graham, Balliol College, Oxford. Your numbers have this staggering picture that not only is the share of wealth growing, but the richer people are, the better they're doing, the 6.8, actually staggering number. We know that there are some economies of scale to wealth management, but these numbers would be staggering economies of scale. So I don't think that's the answer. Why is it that the very, very rich are getting very, very, very much richer than everybody else all the time? What's your explanation for that?
Martin O'Neill, the University of York. In his review of your book in the FT, Martin Wolf said that it had a weakness, that it didn't actually explain why wealth inequality matters, why we should care about this path that we might seem to be on. Now that certainly is very unfair criticism, but I just wondered exactly how you would respond to that. You've already mentioned problems about wealth inequality bleeding into political inequality. Is that the main reason that we should worry about inequalities of wealth, or are there others, or which are the most important reasons?
Hello, Jason Calley, editor of the New Statesman magazine. You watch on say Nick Pierce, sitting next to you, wrote a fine intellectual profile of yourself and a summary of your book. At the end of the 70s, when we had what we might call the neoliberal turn, the Thatcherites had a clear programme: reduce income tax, and at one point they had an income tax rate of 98%, abolish capital controls, liberalise the economy, market reforms, attack union power, strong anti-Soviet foreign policy. There were a clear body of ideas. There were a group of thinkers from whom they drew inspiration: Hayek, Friedman, and others. Margaret Thatcher had intellectual outriders in the party, such as Keith Joseph. What would be a comparable counter-hegemonic project today? It's a good question, but we want to know where it is. Can you provide it, sir?
Maybe for volume 2. Perhaps we can, but let's get into the politics then.
Let's have some politics.
Okay,
so don't forget to have that Miliband's key advisor sitting here.
Okay, so let me try to answer. Let me take the questions as they came. So, first of all, why is it that you? So let me come back maybe to this very high rate of return, because I think these are quite striking. So why do we have this 6 to 7% rate of growth? First of all, it could be that the data is not so good. It could be that when we add a waste tax, we realize that the top, in fact, is not rising that much larger than the average. I will be surprised because in every country where these magazines have tried to collect this data, you see the same evolution. But at the end of the day, what they do in terms of data sources is not so clear. Now, the only reason why I think it's probably robust is that when I use better quality data from university endowments, this is what I get. Okay, so these are the 800 universities in the US. The good thing is that we have good data because they make, unlike the first people who don't want to invest what they do with their money, they make financial statements, so I could use this data. You know what their portfolio is, you know the rate of return they get. This is what they get. And that's pretty good. That's going to be difficult, if you have 100,000 pounds and go to your bank to get that. And you can see that the higher you go, the higher the return. So take Harvard, they obtain the 10%, so that's real net of inflation, net of all administrative fees, net of all management fees. So this is not entrepreneurial input. It's not that the Harvard professors are so smart that they make the right investment. So we've already taken away all the management fees. Okay? So how big are these management fees? So Harvard has right now an endowment of 30 billion. And they spend only 0.3% in management fees. That's 0.3% of 30 billion is already 100 million, which is enough to pay a new team of wealth managers. and this gets you to a return of 10 rather than 6 or even 8 instead of 7, it's worth it. Okay? So I think economies of scale is an important part of the story. Now, I think financial sophistication and financial deregulation has probably exacerbated this in the sense that it has increased the inequality in access to sophisticated financial products. So, I think, according to the textbook model, perfect financial intermediation system should do the opposite, which is that everybody should have access to the best rate of return in Earth. You come with 100,000 pounds in the bank and you put it in the highest yield asset in China, and you get the same rate of return as the highest portfolio of Harvard. But apparently that doesn't seem to be happening, and there's a lot of evidence that investment banks are not giving the same products to everybody, and that the inequality in access to sophisticated financial products and facing increased a lot. Now, I think this is quite, this is a serious issue because, as long as it's only with Harvard and with universities, you can think it's not so bad because Harvard is the university of they are publishing great books and they are producing a lot of research. This can be a problem if you think of poorer universities in the US because this is also increasing the inequality in university funding and unequal access to higher education in the US, as we said before, it's a serious issue for society, for the economy as well. So, but in any case, the problem here is that if you have the same kind of logic for top individual wealth holders, then indeed this creates a powerful divergent force, which frankly, in a way, what we don't really know, and I think what nobody knows, is what's happening for people who are rich but not billionaires. In a way, we don't care so much about billionaires because there are few. So even with this big increase of billionaires over the period, their share in world wealth has increased from 0.5 to 1.5%. So if you take another 20 years before they get 5 or 10%. It's not a real thing to worry, but still, it's not so big because there are few. What matters is what's happening to people who have 10 million, 50 million, 100 million, because this is a much bigger group in terms of number of people, and the share in national wealth in the UK or world wealth is much more substantial. And we don't really know. So the short answer is the best data we have. So that would be the estimate of wealth inequality in the UK that I have put together. So, the share going to the top 10% has certainly been increasing in recent years. From the best data we have, it has gone from about 60% or a little bit more in the 1980s to about 70% now, which means also that the middle class share. So let me make clear that the bottom 50% has basically zero wealth. The bottom 50% has less than 5%, 3 to 4% of total wealth. Now the intermediate group, the middle 40%, who are in between the bottom 50 and the top 10, and that's what I call in the book the wealth middle class. They used to have in the UK, they used to have about 30% or almost 30%, 30-35% of national wealth, and now they are closer to 25%. So this is going in the wrong direction if you look in the sense that the middle class share in national wealth is shrinking. Now, the data we have, is imperfect. It could be that the trend is already bigger than that because we don't measure very well the very top. It could be, we don't really know. But so we are not back. We are certainly not back to 1910. So 1910, we have basically no middle class, in the sense that 90% of the West belong to the top 10. It was actually the same in France at that time. It's very interesting because people in France in 1910 thought that France was, thanks to the Great French Revolution, France was a very poor country. They don't need to introduce progressive taxation of income and wealth, which was actually introduced much before the return in France. And people in France thought, well, this is Britain, of course, should be concerned about the equality because this is an aristocratic country. France, because we had the French Revolution and we don't care about this aristocratic landed estate. Now, in fact, this was really a silly argument, and from the data we have, the wealth concentration was just as large in France in 1910 as in Britain, simply because land at that time did not matter anymore. It's only in Downton Abbey that you have a lot of land, but in UK national wealth, land is less than 5% of total wealth in 1910, and it is the same in France. So it's mostly financial assets, real estate assets, business assets, and the concentration of those assets was actually as large in France as in Britain. So that's we are not back to this kind of situation of extreme concentration of wealth, but this is certainly moving in this direction. At least the share of national wealth going to the middle class is shrinking. How far this will go, I think this will depend on R and G, and what exactly will be those values of R and G, and how this I don't know. So why do we care about this, and what's going to change this? I think what reason why we care is that inequality is okay as long as it is in the common interest, as long as it promotes growth and entrepreneurship, etc., and as long as it benefits in particular the most disadvantaged groups in society. Now, the problem is that extreme inequality is not useful. One of the lessons of the 20th century is that the kind of extreme concentration of wealth that we had in the 19th century was not useful. It disappeared largely due to shocks and also due to taxation, and this did not prevent growth from happening. If anything, post-war growth was higher, and I think we don't want to return to this extreme concentration of wealth, both because it's useless in terms of growth, and because I think it creates an inequality in access to political vote and political power, which is potentially quite threatening for the proper working of our democratic institution. I think part of the reason why European countries did not respond to this very high inequality in pre-World War I era had to do with the extreme concentration of wealth that also led to some extent to extreme concentration of political power. Now, how is that going to change in the future? I don't know. I think the role played. It's a complex process. What made the change in the US and the UK around 1980? I agree. I certainly believe in the power of ideas and the power of books. Now, is the book of Milton Friedman so the result for the term? I will not go so far. Actually, the most important book that Milton Friedman was published 15 years before was the monetary history of the United States. And I think this was important because the very strong thesis that was put by Friedman in this book was, all what we need to regulate capitalism is a good Federal Reserve. We don't need the welfare state, that's useless. If you have a good Federal Reserve that prevents banks from failing in depression, you're going to be fine. And in a way, we are still in this legacy because many people, following the 2008 financial crisis, saw and are still thinking that if you have a right central bank doing the right thing, we are going to be fine. Now, I think we need both a good central bank and a good welfare state and a good progressive tax system. And these are not substitutes; these are complements. And I think in recent years we've been asking too much to creative monetary policy. And of course, monetary policy is much easier than fiscal policy because you can create as many billions of pounds or euros or dollars as you want in a single day. So it's much easier than writing a tax law. Tax law requires the parliament, it requires people to agree. Now the problem is that with these millions and billions of pounds and euros, you can create them in one day, but sometimes you don't really know what you do with them. And you put them somewhere, and you have very low interest rate somewhere, but then you have asset price bubble somewhere else, and huge capital gains and huge returns and profit in some other areas. Sometimes it actually contributes to rising inequality in rates of return. So I think, I believe in the battle of ideas in the sense that, I believe, the proper analysis of what these different institutions can do and have done in history has been important in the past. Book of Freedom was important, and overrules were important, and the books will also be important in the future. But I think, if you want to understand this big term, and in particular, this, you mentioned the 98% tax rate in the UK, and I think something that maybe was even more important. So you have, in the UK, in the US, we had this huge decline in top tax rate around 1980. Now, I think in order to understand this big shift of policy, I think you have to look also at the history of national identity. I guess in the 70s, people in Britain and in the US were increasingly concerned about the idea that there was these countries were being overtaken by Germany, Japan, or even France or Italy, which is getting really annoying, and people were very depressed about that. I think part of it was just the normal catch-up process had to do, a big part. Why is it that we had a much bigger growth rate in Germany and Japan and France in the 1950s, 60s, 70s than in Britain and the US? Partly this was, I think because there was a lot of catch-up to do after the war, where the German and Japanese and French GDP growth in 1950 was really low. So I think this would have happened no matter what. And the growth performance of the US economy and the UK economy in the past 30 years is not very different from what you have with the German growth. Then you have, some countries are doing better than others for various reasons. I'm not sure the change in the tax rates at the top are the main reason. I think difference in the labor market policy, the education system. Probably, the main reason why Britain was being sort of overtaken by other countries in the 50s, 60s, 70s had more to do with the deficiencies of the education system and the education system that was not sufficiently inclusive than with the tax policy. If you compare, maybe 98% was a bit too much, but if you compare, if you take the case of the US and you compare the growth performance of US companies in the 50s, 60s, 70s with those of US companies today, right now in the US you have rising top compensation everywhere, rising inequality everywhere, except in the growth statistics. The growth performance, the productivity growth of the US past 2 to 3 decades has not been terribly good. So if you have, it's okay to have a huge rise in top managerial compensation if you get a huge growth rate out of it. But if you have a 1.5 per capita growth and 2/3 of that to the top 1%, I'm not sure it's a good deal. But national perceptions are also influenced by people. I think probably in this country and in the US, people still live with the view that this big change around 1980 allowed to put an end to these countries being overtaken by the rest of the world. I think this is largely illusory. I think this is largely due to the fact that the catch-up was over in 1980. Or even 1970 with Britain, but issues of income and money are not just an issue about money. They are issues of honors and national perceptions, and countries need tell stories to themselves as to why they are poorer or richer than their neighbors, and sometimes these stories are wrong, but they matter a lot in national perceptions. And so books can have an impact, but I think we should not overestimate the impact of books. And at the end, everybody has his own theory, has his own learning, and I guess in the end, this just shows that income and wealth matters not only for economists and policymakers, but matters for everyone.
Well, I'm afraid to say it's coming up to the end of our session, but if any book can have an impact, will have. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I'm sorry I'm not been able to get everybody in, but we did have a very strict deadline, so we got 4 from come from Paris to the speakers. I want to thank you enormously for your time. It's superb talk, and it's an incredibly important book. If you haven't read it, please do investigate the issues that it raises, because they are profound in our society. Can I ask you to give a very big thanks to
l'ISS, pour l'SS,